There are some legal cases where the accused person will not want to hear the verdict. There are, unfortunately, many legal cases where the victim won't want to hear the verdict. But I can think of only one English legal case where the consequences were so significant that the judge did not want to deliver the verdict. Bought like an animal far from the place where he grew up and transported to be sold, then transported again miles across the seas in a great ship to the shores of England. The man named Mr. Somerset, a name given to him not at birth, took the role of a slave for his master, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Somerset's role was to carry out jobs for Mr. Stewart. As part of his travels, Mr. Somerset would have seen much of the land of England, not a great deal of people of his own kind, and all of those who he did see were probably likely to be slaves at that time. Eventually becoming weary of his position in life, Mr. Somerset did the only thing that a man in that position can do out of desperation. He tried to escape. Unfortunately, for a man in Mr. Somerset's position and of his appearance at that time, it was difficult to stay concealed for long in England. It wasn't long before Mr. Somerset, now christened James, was thrown into jail on a boat kept by a friend of his master, Mr. Stewart, ready to be taken overseas to be sold on yet again. I imagine Mr. Somerset sitting in the hulk of the ship, could probably only see one small chink of light through the wood of his cell. But just at that same time, a gleam of hope entered James's life. Friends of his, who had helped to have him christened, clubbed together all the help that they could, and they did something that was almost as brave and extraordinary as what James had done himself. They took Mr. Stewart, the master, to court. Now, there was not much hope for James in an English court. He had been bought lawfully, he had been transported lawfully, and the British Empire at that time relied significantly on slavery. The judge trying the case, Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice, was a servant of the Empire. Now, Lord Mansfield was so keen not to hear the case that he tried 3 times to get the parties to agree out of court, to stop trying the case or perhaps accept damages. And eventually he even said to the parties who had helped James, christened him, and were now trying to free him, he said, please, just buy the man, just get him out of my court. I do not want to try this case. But the parties on both sides stood firm. Lord Mansfield issued a stern warning. The Lord Chief Justice, seated in his great chair of authority, leant down into the court and said, Fiat Justitia, ruat caelum. Now what that means is let justice be done, though the heavens may fall. But who of the parties Was this a warning too? Now, you will of course know that slavery is illegal these days, and that is so fundamental to law that you might see it in English law in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. For example, in employment law, a person will generally make a contract, that's an agreement, with another person by which one agrees to work for the other. In contract law, generally, there are usually two remedies if someone breaks a contract. Now, the first will be money in exchange for the loss that the person has suffered by the contract not being carried out as it was agreed. The second remedy that a court can sometimes grant on breach of contract is called specific performance. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that the court sides with the innocent party, and they will enforce the contract. They will make sure that the party who broke it will carry out the things that they originally agreed to. In employment law, a court will almost never grant specific performance. Why is that? It's because if you think about it, forcing someone to work for another person, even if it's on perfectly fair terms and they may have originally agreed to it on those terms, it is so close to slavery that the English courts simply will not allow it. It is too much of an infringement on personal freedom. In another area of law, company law, you will look, if you take a look hard enough, if you have the will to do that, you can see at the bottom of large companies' websites, there will be a modern slavery statement. Now, I'm not suggesting you go through reading those, but company law requires English companies of a certain size to explain how they're trying to stamp out modern slavery in their supply chain, not just in England, but overseas. So fundamental is the right of freedom. And last, but by no means least, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 ensures that a person cannot simply be thrown in jail willy-nilly by the police just because they want to. Arrest really means taking a person prisoner, just in the same way, I suppose, as in the ye olde times, somebody might have been thrown in a dungeon or a cell. Being thrown in a cell is just as much of a serious matter these days, and the law will not allow it without good reason. One thing I can't resist mentioning at this point, if you ever read George Orwell's book 1984, in which the thought police and state control are significant matters, is the startling irony of the fact that the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which regulates arrest and other matters, was passed into law in the year 1984. Now, this is no laughing matter, and I am by no means making light of it. But you have to say that someone in government really hit the nail on the head, waiting until that specific year to put this bill into law. One other thing which I'd just like to mention is that I film these videos for interest, not for publicity and not for profit. If you're finding them at all interesting, or indeed if you think that society generally is depraved and perhaps YouTube should feature a bit more law and justice, then please click the subscribe button. It really gives me a boost of enthusiasm and it pushes this video higher up on other people's lists so more people can see it. And it's totally free. Anyway, Section 41 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act says that a person cannot be held for more than 24 hours unless they've been charged with an offence. Now, I won't go into detail on what that means, but it's basically the modern version of an old law called habeas corpus in the Latin, which doesn't translate very well directly, but what it does mean is that you cannot imprison somebody, even if that's a lawful arrest, without good reason. Now, this was actually exactly the matter that was being tried in James Somerset's case. Lord Mansfield spent around a month deliberating on what to decide in James Somerset's case. After a month or so, he summoned the parties back to court to hear his decision. And finally, he gave a judgment which I think sounds so well in the ye olde language of the law reports from the time that if you'll indulge me, I will read it out word for word how it was reported there. He said, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only positive law." And what he means there is that he will not enforce slavery unless the law gives him absolutely no other option. He says, "Positive law preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory." And this is the excellent part. "It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law." Lord Mansfield then followed his earlier warning to the slave owners of Britain and the parties in court by saying, "Whatever inconveniences may follow from this decision, I cannot say the case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the man must be discharged." Now that, as far as we know, is where it ended for James Somerset. A free man who did exactly what every free man is entitled to do, and seems to have pretty much disappeared from history at this point. But it wasn't quite the end for the case. Abolitionist campaigners apparently seized on the case, saying that it was quite clear even the law of England did not support its own slavery practices. Lord Mansfield himself, however, actually tried to narrow the importance of the case later on, apparently, by saying in another case that it only decided a very specific point of law that was asked him and did not comment further on slavery as a whole. Now, this might sound cowardly, but actually, Lord Mansfield was just referring to a very fundamental principle that is as old as English law itself, which is that a judge can only answer the question that has been put to him. Anything else that he may wish to say is called obiter dicta, and what that means is words said in passing, which do not have any legal force, even if they're right. Lord Mansfield was asked whether James Somerset could go free in that case. Lord Mansfield answered that question, and anything he said about slavery as a whole could not influence the law until Parliament voted on that matter a little later. Secondly, Lord Mansfield was no coward. Just 8 years after giving James Somerset his freedom, Lord Mansfield's own house was burnt because of the fact he had taken the side of another oppressed group in English society, this time Catholic people. Interestingly, Charles Dickens actually describes the riots in his book Barnaby Rudge, where he says that the lawmakers stood firm in their conviction to fairness and that justice should be done at any cost or hazard. Now I wonder where he got that phrase from, or should I say, who he got that phrase from. Now, Dickens gives a good telling, as much as such a thing can be good, of the attack on Lord Mansfield's house in Barnaby Rudge. But I think that the most meaningful part of the book is actually his description of the damage to the house of the stubborn old barman John Willett, and his reaction to the sad state of affairs when his property is ransacked just a few chapters before. Now, both Dickens and Lord Mansfield understood the importance of fairness and of justice, and they both understood, I think, how it feels to be downtrodden. They could relate to people in that situation. I'll end with the sad words of old John Willett, sitting in his destroyed home, contemplating the destruction done to him.
John knitted his brow, looked downwards as if he were mentally engaged in some arithmetical calculation, then upwards as if the total would not come to his call, then at his friend, from his eyebrow to his shoe buckle, then very slowly round the bar, and then a great, round, leaden-looking, and not at all transparent tear came rolling out of each eye, and he said, as he shook his head, "If they'd only had the goodness to murder me, I'd have thanked them kindly."
Cheerio for now.